sheer dumbness, okay, had enough class. Well, I tried to hide, because if that ever happens, I don't think Hearst would have stooped to that.
Orson Welles, the cinematic genius behind Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons, had a dark side even Hollywood feared. Behind his brilliance lurked a director who didn't hesitate to voice his contempt for fellow actors. There were 7 he particularly despised, and his opinions, both personal and professional, made sets tense and collaborations nearly impossible. Welles's fury was legendary, and the reasons behind his deep dislike for certain Hollywood icons reveal a complex mix of artistic judgment, personal grudges, and an uncompromising vision of what cinema should be. Spencer Tracy, a titan of Hollywood's golden age, and often spoken of alongside Laurence Olivier and Marlon Brando, was for many the very image of naturalistic acting. With 2 Oscars, 9 nominations, and a legendary on-screen partnership with Katharine Hepburn, Tracy was considered untouchable. But Welles thought otherwise. He didn't just critique Tracy's performances, he outright dismissed them, claiming he couldn't remember a single role of Tracy's that moved him. The only exception, Welles admitted, was Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, but even that wasn't enough to change his mind. Welles's contempt extended beyond acting ability. He viewed Tracy and Hepburn's films as sentimental, shallow products of the studio system, emblematic of everything he hated about Hollywood's polished mediocrity. He wasn't subtle about it either, once calling Tracy a hateful, hateful man. That level of disdain suggested something deeper than professional disagreement, something bitter and personal. To Welles, Tracy's restrained realism felt like a refusal to reach for greatness, while he himself sought to reinvent cinema. Humphrey Bogart, the face of noir, projected tough, gritty authority in classics like Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon. He became a cultural symbol of stoic masculinity, admired by millions. But Welles saw through what he considered a carefully curated illusion. He called Bogart a coward who staged barroom fights just to bolster his image. According to Welles, Bogart picked his scuffles carefully, always ensuring that help would arrive before things got serious. To Welles, it wasn't bravery, it was showmanship. What truly enraged him was how Hollywood and audiences swallowed the myth, confusing the character with the man. While Bogart built a legend, Welles believed he built a lie, and for a man who valued authenticity above all, that was unforgivable. Norma Shearer, once crowned the First Lady of MGM, was another target of Welles's scorn. He once dismissed her as one of the most minimally talented ladies to appear on the silver screen. Her critics often whispered that her rise had more to do with her marriage to MGM's head of production, Irving Thalberg, than with her talent. Welles seemed to agree. For him, Shearer symbolized the artificial privilege and manipulation of the studio system. But the reality was more nuanced. Shearer fought for complex roles during an era when women were expected to be little more than decorative. Her Oscar win for The Divorcee and 6 total nominations tell a different story. One of a pioneering woman who challenged gender norms and helped shape female stardom in the 1930s. Still, Welles was never one for nuance. He reduced her to a symbol of systemic favoritism, ignoring her ambition and achievements. The irony, of course, is that Shearer, like Welles, refused to conform. She broke rules too, but with subtlety rather than theatrical rebellion. To Welles, though, that wasn't enough. She wasn't raw enough, rebellious enough, real enough. Richard Burton, hailed early in his career as a great dramatic talent, was to Welles a tragic case of self-sabotage. Welles admired Burton's early work, his voice, his presence, his Shakespearean training. But admiration quickly turned to disappointment as Burton's career took a more commercial turn. Welles accused him of squandering his gifts, saying he now worked for money, does the worst. The criticism wasn't just about roles, it was about values. Burton's high-profile marriage to Elizabeth Taylor and their tabloid-fueled lives further soured Welles, who saw it as evidence of a man who had traded art for spectacle. Burton's late career choices, films like Bluebeard and The Sandpiper, cemented Welles's view that the actor had sold out. Even when Burton showed flashes of brilliance in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, it wasn't enough to redeem him. To Welles, who sacrificed career stability for artistic control, Burton's descent was not just disappointing, it was a betrayal of the craft. Laurence Olivier, long considered one of the greatest actors of the 20th century, wasn't safe from Welles's judgment either. Most saw Olivier as the gold standard for Shakespearean performance, but Welles saw smoke and mirrors. He thought Olivier was technically proficient, but emotionally hollow. Welles was particularly brutal about Olivier's performance in King Lear, calling it the worst thing I ever saw in my life. For Welles, Olivier represented the kind of actor who relied on style over substance, theatrical tricks over truth. He even dismissed him as stupid, a shocking insult considering Olivier's intellectual reputation. Welles's criticism wasn't just about performance, it was personal and pointed, a rejection of the critical consensus that had elevated Olivier to legendary status. While audiences saw brilliance, Welles saw artifice. Charlie Chaplin, a cinematic titan whose influence shaped the language of film, also came under fire. Welles acknowledged Chaplin's genius, but couldn't stand the man behind it. He described him as arrogant and emotionally unbearable. Their one creative intersection came when Welles pitched a film about the French serial killer Henri Landru. Chaplin took the idea, paid Welles a modest fee, and turned it into Monsieur Verdoux, a film he wrote, directed, and starred in. Welles later claimed he had written much more of the story than he was credited for, accusing Chaplin of hijacking the project and sidelining him. To Welles, it wasn't about money, it was about artistic authorship. He saw Chaplin as a domineering egoist who suffocated collaboration. The comparison he later made between Chaplin and Woody Allen, another artist he disliked, underscored his distaste for auteurs who, in his eyes, allowed insecurity and arrogance to override their work. Both men were perfectionists, but in Welles's mind, Chaplin's need to control was more about ego than excellence. Joan Fontaine found herself opposite Welles in Jane Eyre 1943, a pairing that looked ideal on paper but collapsed under the weight of clashing egos. Welles thought little of Fontaine's acting, once reducing her entire skill set to 2 expressions, and that's it. Fontaine didn't take the insult lying down. In her autobiography, she described Welles as overbearing and obsessed with control. She admitted his brilliance, especially when directing himself, but painted a portrait of a man who could not collaborate unless he held complete authority. Their different acting styles, Welles's booming theatricality and Fontaine's quiet restraint, clashed both on and off screen. But Welles didn't stop at criticizing Fontaine. He extended his scorn to her sister Olivier de Havilland, another Oscar-winning actress, dismissing both siblings by questioning how they'd even had careers. For Welles, their success was incomprehensible proof, perhaps, of a Hollywood system that celebrated the wrong things. The Fontaine-de Havilland rivalry was the stuff of legend, but to Welles, neither sister had anything to offer artistically. That harshness may have come from resentment, frustration, or simply his intolerance for anyone who didn't measure up to his exacting standards. So what do these 7 actors, Spencer Tracy, Humphrey Bogart, Norma Shearer, Richard Burton, Laurence Olivier, Charlie Chaplin, and Joan Fontaine, have in common beyond Welles's contempt? For the most part, they represented the very things Welles warred against his entire career: the studio system, commercial compromise, surface-level performance, and the mythology of Hollywood stardom. Some, like Burton and Olivier, had talent, but, in Welles's eyes, misused it. Others, like Shearer and Fontaine, were products of privilege and polish rather than raw ability. Welles saw himself as a guardian of artistic integrity, a man who sacrificed success for principle, and in doing so he gave himself permission to speak brutal truths, or at least his version of them. Whether his judgments were fair or driven by ego is up for debate, but one thing is certain: he had no tolerance for what he saw as mediocrity, no matter how beloved or iconic the performer. He believed that the pedestal of fame should be reserved for those who truly pushed the boundaries of their craft, not for those who merely played it safe or rode the wave of public adoration. For Welles, art was sacred, and anyone who treated it as a commodity, whether through formulaic performances or careerist choices, was a betrayer of its spirit. This unrelenting idealism often isolated him, even earned him enemies, but it also cemented his legacy as a fearless critic in an industry where flattery and compromise were the norm. His opinions, however harsh, were rooted in a deep reverence for cinema's potential, and that, above all, defined his crusade.